Now, Mill is quick to try to improve upon Bentham's formulation of utilitarianism. We noticed before that Bentham seemed to equate happiness with pleasure. Mill wanted to distance himself from that particular equation. He writes of the theory, "Such a theory of life, as formulated by Bentham, excites in many minds inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has no higher end than pleasure, these critics of utilitarianism, designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine." That is, Mill's concern is that you might think that to be utilitarian, all you need to do is to maximize pleasure in a relatively bodily sense, if not necessarily your own, then that of other people, but still it's pleasure that is the bottom line for the utilitarian. But Mill wants to say that's a simplified and simple-minded version of the theory. He goes on, "It's quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize that some pleasures are more desirable and more valuable than others." Mill's utilitarianism has no objection to pleasure per se, but he wants to say that some pleasures are higher, and to that extent they're going to be, in some sense, worth more than the pleasures that are more basic. So, how do you solve this problem? How do you tell which pleasures are more valuable than others? Well, he writes, "Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both have a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that's the more desirable pleasure." Here's what Mill means by that. I'm sure you've had experience in which, for instance, when you were a teenager, you would listen to a certain kind of music and thought at the time that it was fantastic. And as you got a bit older, you realized that that music was not so great. Perhaps the emotions that it dealt with were a little bit banal, a little bit simple-minded. You now like your music to be a little more complicated, perhaps more edgy, perhaps more self-reflective, for instance. You might think that the pleasure you got out of the music that you enjoyed when you were, say, 13 years old is a lower pleasure than the pleasure that you get out of music that you enjoy now. Likewise, there are certain kinds of food that you might have thought were fantastic back when you were 7 that you think are not acceptable to your palate now because they are perhaps unsubtle combinations of flavors or textures. You want things that are more sophisticated. Or you might find that reading books, when you read novels, for instance, the novels that you enjoy now are more complicated, are more sophisticated in some way than the ones that you enjoyed when you were a tween. The idea being that it's not as if you didn't get pleasure from these things back when you were 13 years old or 12 years old, but you might now say the pleasures that I got were pleasures that are not as high, not as valuable as the ones that I get now that I appreciate literature of a higher, more sophisticated kind. But Mill's trying also to guard against people being too snobbish here. That is to say, a pleasures being higher is not because someone in a position of authority, cultural prestige, etc., says that the pleasure is higher. No, Mill wants to be democratic. Mill wants to say, make sure that you've got a lot of people who are able to compare these two different perspective pleasures, and they are not biased. They don't feel obligated morally or in any other way to prefer one over the other. They want to give each of these apparent pleasures a fair shot. They've got experience with both. They're relatively even-handed, unbiased, and they try them both. If the majority go for pleasure A over pleasure B, happiness type A over happiness type B, then A just is a higher pleasure than is B. That is to say, if it turns out that the majority of people who are unbiased and open-minded, they listen to some Beethoven and they listen to some Death Cab for Cutie, and they compare and they contrast and they consider both of them carefully and they say Beethoven, then Beethoven's a higher pleasure than Death Cab for Cutie. But Mill is going to say there's no reason in principle why it has to go that way. It could be that Death Cab is a higher pleasure than Beethoven, if that's how things work out according to most people's unbiased and considered reflective judgments. Then Death Cab's a higher pleasure than Beethoven. Even if the cultural authorities in our society tend to think otherwise, that would still be what Mill would be committed to. So the idea is we've got a way of saying what pleasures are higher than others. Let's just let people vote with their feet, so long as they give each of the two prospective pleasures a fair shot. But this enables Mill to now say, okay, I'm going to probably end up finding that just soaking in a hot tub and imbibing something that causes me to go into a higher state, or at least a more relaxed state, is fine, but there are other things in life than that. I don't feel that my life will be fulfilled, will be lived fully if that's all I get. I also want, for example, things like I get great pleasure out of other things such as connecting with an old friend, or having an honest outpouring of emotion with someone that I care about, or doing something difficult. We talked before in our discussion of the philosophy of religion about the question, what exactly would heaven be like? How precisely would one find eternal bliss in heaven? And one of our questions there was, if heaven does not contain within it things that are challenging, things that are difficult, things at which I might sometimes fail, then it's not clear that it would be so satisfying to be there, simply because so much of the pleasure that we get out of our lives is often because we are engaged in the task of doing something difficult. We might fail, we often do, but that's part of what makes those activities satisfying, is that they're challenging as opposed to just plain easy as working our way through a bowl of whipped cream or something. So Mill's got something to say about this idea that some pleasures are higher than others, and I think that insofar as he does, he's got a useful potential response to the worthy of swine criticism that can be leveled against Bentham and his formulation of utilitarianism. Now, Mill, in fact, predicts the outcome of this democratic test, by the way, and he says, few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of the beast's pleasure. That is to say, if someone were to come up to you and say, look, if you allow me to turn you into a pig, promise we won't kill you, won't slaughter you and make you into bacon, we're just going to turn you into a pig, and you'll get unlimited amounts of mud, unlimited numbers of things to eat, you'll be as happy as pigs are capable of being. Mill says most people would not accept such an option. They would say, no, I'd rather continue my life as a human being, not because I'd be doubtful as to whether I'd make pig friends, I'm not so worried about being lonely and so forth, but rather because those pig pleasures are somehow limiting. Mill says, thinking about one of the great philosophers of antiquity, Socrates, he says, well, there are two different ideas, happiness on the one hand and being content on the other. But I'd much rather be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. That is, I realize that there are many nobler feelings that in many of us have been extinguished because we didn't cultivate them at an early time in our lives. But for those of us who do have the capacity for nobler feelings, it seems to us that a satisfied life is going to require some kind of combination of not just tranquility, but also some excitement. We need to have peace, but we also need to have a certain amount of punctuation of that peace for things that are more challenging, that are more exciting. Pigs don't seem to have very much of that. I'd rather, he says, be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He goes on and explains that the cultivation of one's mind is something that can cause us to lose our capacity to appreciate the higher things if left uncultivated for a long enough time. He writes, next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. If you lose your curiosity and your desire to expand and extend, challenge yourself in new ways, then the world will turn gray, so to speak, and you will lose your ability to appreciate so many different things. Whereas a mind that's cultivated finds sources of inexhaustible interest in all that surrounds it. So Mill wants to suggest that at least so long as you keep your mind cultivated, active, keep the wheels turning, remain curious, remain committed to trying to expand your horizons, learn new things, and challenge yourself in new ways, you will find that the notion of happiness that's required in order to fulfill that way of living is a valuable one, is one that a very satisfied pig is not capable of achieving, and which is also one that allows us to explain how happiness on the properly construed utilitarian theory is one in which there are higher as well as lower pleasures, and the higher pleasures in a way count for more than do the lower pleasures, and should thereby weigh more in the, so to speak, philosophic calculus.